Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. That's not fair. Are words regularly heard coming from somewhere in our house. They're usually uttered by Martha, but occasionally they come from Sarah or even sometimes myself. That's not fair could be the title of the parable from Matthew's Gospel that is our reading today. I'll share it with you now. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire labourers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the labourers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the labourers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. "That's not fair" is the exclamation of those who have worked hard all day when they receive exactly the pay they've been promised. It was likely a small amount, but fair for a day's work. Now, if you consider that experience in isolation, claiming that's not fair seems particularly odd. But they have seen the landowner paying others, those who had worked far less, the same amount. Now, it is worth remembering at this stage that we are handling one of Jesus' parables. Parables were not intended to be straightforward stories that can be easily interpreted. Parables left their listeners scratching their heads, thinking for one moment that they'd got it, and then having their understanding turned upside down. Life is not fair. And that is at least one layer of meaning emerging from the parable. The landowner reminds those workers that he has fulfilled his promise to them in full. Why are they resentful for generosity shown to others? This parable is not simply about the generosity of God, but the effect of this generosity and compassion. Jesus introduces the parable with those familiar words, "The kingdom of heaven is like." In the kingdom of heaven, we will see people who haven't worked as hard or as long as us, but get the same reward. If we're brutally honest with ourselves, that almost offends us. The world has taught us how to know what is fair. And this parable, these actions, rub against that understanding. Something doesn't seem right about it. We are thinking like those who have worked all day. That's not fair. If we view the landowner as representing God, we might quickly conclude that God is not fair. The parable is great news to those hired at the end of the day, promised to be paid what was fair, and even to those hired at midday, with the same unnamed but just amount promised. It's harder to hear this as good news if we've been there all day. But what is abundantly clear here is that God has different standards than we do in regard to how he deals with people. The workers protest that in his decision, the landowner has made all his hired workers equal, and in their eyes, they are not. The truth is that these workers, and we ourselves, rely on systems of inequality in order to maintain our own sense of worth and value. Work is far more than just earning a daily wage. It determines whether or not we are considered a success or a failure, superior or inferior. It is a source of division and competition. This parable is not simply about the generosity of God, but the effect of this generosity and compassion. And the landowner turns our understanding around by showing generosity to everyone. This is what the kingdom of heaven is like. Generosity shared with everyone. In showing generosity to all workers, the landowner wasn't taking away from the first workers. He was simply adding to those who would be blessed. I mean, it's not like there was just one pie which is being divided into smaller and smaller pieces because more and more people want something. Everyone was getting pie. You have to wonder how this parable was understood by hearers at the time. Perhaps the late workers were seen as the sinners and the Gentiles being included in the community. Perhaps the grumbling workers were the religious leaders with their usual objections to inclusion. Or perhaps they were the disciples, Jesus' inner crowd, who felt that they were deserving of something more than the rest of his followers. Whatever our interpretation, this is a story of reversal and unexpected equalizations. Parables should enable us to turn the mirror on ourselves, inviting us to put ourselves into the story. No matter where we locate ourselves here, we're asked to consider how we might respond to God's grace. Whether it is expected because of a relationship established long ago, or is something that comes in the middle of a day, or even at the last minute. If we find ourselves among the grumblers, we might be being challenged to check our privilege and to ask ourselves why we find the idea of others receiving the most basic daily needs so difficult. Just because someone else is receiving pie does not automatically mean that there is less pie for us. The landowner invites those who grumble to take a different perspective. And the literal translation of the question he asks reads, Is your eye evil? You see, the struggle here is not really with the payment of the later workers. The struggle is with the lens through which the original workers are viewing the situation. Perhaps, if they can understand the true beauty of the grace shown to those they deem undeserving, they might realise that the same measure of unbelievable, unmerited, loving grace is what has been given to them. This parable calls attention to the ongoing need for us all to examine ourselves, to realise that perhaps we aren't really as deserving of the privileges we hold as we like to think. But we are completely reliant on God's grace alone. This deep thinking inevitably forces us to face some hard questions concerning our priorities and our opinion of others. There will be work to do. It will cause us to push back. But God always leans towards the generous side in his dealings with people. We should strive to do likewise and celebrate the grace and generosity of God wherever and whenever they become evident. Amen.